Sam is a senior design consultant here at Cantina. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning.
We're excited to have you join the webinar today. The topic is Design I/O, creating visual interfaces for digital systems. A few announcements before we get started. Please feel free to post any questions that you might have while the presentation is taking place, and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or at the end. And I will now turn it over to Sam.
Great. Thanks, Clark. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as Clark mentioned, I'm a senior design consultant here at Cantina. I've spent several years now at different agencies designing websites and digital interfaces, both for small startups, but also larger enterprise companies across a variety of industries. A large part of my job is focused on improving user experience through better visual design and interactive design principles. Today, I'm going to discuss a few of these principles and ways of thinking that have been successful in our design practice here at Cantina. In this webinar series that we've been doing over the last couple of months, we've been talking about the value of design in some different ways. And today, I'm going to delve a bit deeper into the specifics of visual design and interaction design, what things look like and how they work. I'll discuss a couple key mindsets and explain a simple framework used for how we organize the various exercises that help guide visual design decisions. Here's our agenda for the day. I'm going to cover atomic design and systems thinking. We'll then delve into the actual framework, Design I/O. We'll go through individually each input, output, and then we're going to circle back to some lean UX principles and talk a little bit how all this ties together. Finally, we'll close with an example project, something that we've done here at Cantina in the last year. And then we'll wrap up with time for some questions and any other information. So before we dive into the framework itself, I wanted to better define a key mindset we need as we go about the process of visual and interaction design. Brad Frost and others have spoken at length about this concept of atomic design and how digital interfaces can be broken down into distinct units called atoms, molecules, and organisms. Brad's actually in the process of writing a book about how these small interface elements build up to create layout templates and pages, which is what we actually see when we're viewing a website or an app. The current draft of the book is available online at the URL here, and I recommend giving it a read. At Cantina, we found that the concepts of atomic design resonate with our experience, and this thinking continues to influence how we do our design work. So, at its core, atomic design means that we work through the design of digital products, or as we work through the design of digital products, we must be careful to think in terms of systems of components and move away from a page-first mentality of old. The term page is actually a carryover from the print era, and it's no longer an adequate description of what we create when we're working in digital medium. There are very few cases today where a single page will present the same information in the same exact manner to every visitor who sees it. Most of the time, what your organization refers to as a product page, a user profile view, or even a contact page is actually a complex layout built up of systems of distinct components, things such as buttons, text links, content blocks, icons, images, and more. These components must be assembled in different ways depending on varying contexts, such as location or region, user permissions, device type, even time of day. Effective visual design, therefore, not only considers the final page view that the user sees, but more so how that page is assembled from all the various components in light of these contextual factors. Instead of designing static page layouts, we have to focus on designing components and the visual system that builds up to those individual views. This is an important distinction and one that you'll see influences all aspects of the visual design process. To help demonstrate this focus on atomic design and systems thinking, let's look at a quick example. The travel website Lonely Planet recently released a beta version of a redesigned user interface, basically for a portion of their site that focuses on some of the destinations that people try and go. While I personally don't have any insider knowledge about the organization's specific goals for this effort, my observations indicate that much of the content is the same as what was on the previous version of their site. It appears that with this effort, they've introduced a better visual design for consuming that same information. And this should help us highlight a few important ideas that emphasize this systems first mentality. Since I spent some time in Vancouver this summer, I'm going to start with a breakdown of the Vancouver destination page. Right away, we're presented with a large hero image, some top-level navigation, a logo, and then smaller on-page navigation that appears below the hero image. Clicking the C link in this on-page navigation actually reveals that this is an on-page section and drops us down into this top experiences section. In this section, you can see there's 4 cards, each listing a popular thing to do while visiting the city of Vancouver. These cards have an image, an attraction name and location, and a simple set of numbered chiclets indicating their relative popularity by some ranking system. As we look at different cities, say Boston, close to our heart here in Cantina, and then Montreal, you can see that this same pattern applies across all of these. What this means is that in the process of designing this card set, all types of photographic and text content must be considered. You could easily envision a case where a designer focused on getting things just right for the Vancouver page focuses in too closely on their names and their locations and images and fails to design something that would work for the other pages. Because these cards are fed from a larger system, that system is what must be designed, not simply the Vancouver page. When designing things like this, it's important to identify the endpoint. In the case of experience cards, the design team had to ideally look at the full list of possible attraction names and then identify both the shortest name and the longest name, the 2 endpoints. They then had to design a card that would be pleasing in both of these situations. You can see this here by looking at the Granville Island and the Chinatown cards. Another important tactic to designing for a system like Lonely Planet is considering the costs and business impacts. Outside of standard time and cost implications for design and engineering, visual design needs to consider overall business context and the resources required to produce some of these things. If we scroll down further on the page and look at this travel guide section, we see here that 2 print guides are shown, one for British Columbia and then the hidden one in the back for Vancouver. This section as well needs to be customized depending on the regional context and would obviously appear differently for Boston and Montreal. Depending on what photos Lonely Planet already has available for these books and what city or regional guides are in print, this section could have very different cost implications for additional product staging, photo shoots, and then ultimately the image asset production required to get images of these things up on the website. This is another example of a small design decision affecting a larger system. A wise designer will do their best to consider the implications of improving visual design in this section versus taking into account what imagery is already available and weighing the cost of producing all those new visual assets. Realizing that each of the components and UI elements on a given page will be reused across other areas of the site, we can employ a design process that focuses first on the underlying components of the system, not simply on the home page or all location pages or destination pages, for example. We have to focus on hierarchy and the relationship between components to ensure we're building a system up bit by bit. Buttons, for example, are the most basic reusable element, and many sites define different types for primary functions, secondary functions, and even utility functions. Focusing on the components helps us to improve overall user experience by building visual consistency, but it also improves development efficiency and streamlines future design work, say in a case where we're going to add pages to this Lonely Planet website. Lonely Planet embraced this on their last iteration, as demonstrated by the pattern library they built and shared publicly. I'm going to bring that up here now so we can take a quick peek at it. So this is a screenshot of what is obviously focused on their current user interface. This isn't focused on the beta version. But you can see how this pattern library is grouped by, at the top right, design elements, UI components, and a couple more development central sections for JavaScript, widgets, and CSS utilities. Under the UI components, you can see clearly defined atomic elements like text cards, image cards, destination cards, as well as the standard collections of navigation and form elements broken out in the navigation on the left. This pattern library demonstrates how full page designs can be broken down into their atomic units and managed as a complete system, not simply a set of page views. Employing this level of systems thinking helps design, engineering, and content teams stay on the same page and understand how individual components both relate to each other and then become used consistently across the interface. So, to recap, here are a couple of atomic design tips to help us stay focused on visual systems. First, we talked about identifying the endpoints, knowing the full range of possible design solutions that have to play into a certain visual section and designing with those in mind. Next, we covered considering costs and business impacts, knowing the difference between a small design decision that doesn't have a lot of hidden costs and ones that have more impacts, like photographing a bunch of new style guides or a bunch of new travel guides. And then finally, focus on component relationships. Think about the atomic units and consider how the system slays together even before you get to a page view. All right, so using Lonely Planet as a guide, we talked about this atomic design mentality. Now let's talk about the process itself. I like to think about visual design as a series of inputs and outputs. In this framework, you'll see 5 inputs to visual design listed on the left, flowing into the middle section here, and then outflowing to the 5 outputs on the right. The middle represents the iterative work of putting color, type, lines, and shapes on a digital canvas, soliciting feedback, and constantly refining that design. This list of inputs and outputs isn't comprehensive by any means, and it intentionally omits research methods that are more in the domain of user experience work. Again, we're focused today primarily visual and interaction design. This framework is specifically meant to show the types of exercises that visual design needs and help us translate abstract ideas about look and feel into functional interfaces that both look sharp and work well. All right, to help us discuss the process further, let's go through exactly what each of these inputs are. We'll give some quick examples and talk about when and why each should be used. Metaphor questions are our first type of input. These are questions for stakeholders that use familiar brands and other known conventions to generate descriptor words and perceptions about the feeling of a digital product. A few common examples include questions like, if your website was a car, what brand would it be? If your product had a celebrity or spokesperson, who would it be and why? Think of William Shatner and some of the others that are out there. As you can imagine, a digital product that is supposed to feel like a luxury BMW will need a very different look and feel than one that is more in line with a utilitarian minivan. Metaphor questions are good at uncovering differences in stakeholder opinions about how their brand or digital product should be perceived. Discovering these contrasts early helps us get a true discussion started about design, look, and feel, and helps establish a common starting point for further exploration. All right, next up, branding analysis. Brand analysis is focused on overall look and feel, think colors, type, photography, images. It helps us to identify some of the pieces that currently are in existence for a given organization's brand, or the interface pieces that are already established in a web app or a website that is already in existence if we're designing a new feature or a new set of pages for that. Branding analyses help us to identify reusable elements and uncover the backstory on how those were created. For anything that has a design established, there's always going to be a backstory of how they got there that you're not going to be able to see just from looking at the pages themselves. So it's important to uncover what that is. The other piece of this is understanding what current guidelines are already in existence and how much they're adhered to. Some places have 200-page style guide books, but for one reason or another, they're not actually applicable to the new product that they're designing. So it's important to understand those. And then the second part of a brand analysis is beyond looking at your own organization, looking at competitor organizations as well. Understanding from a visual perspective, what are similarities, what are differences, how can you, from a visual standpoint, better differentiate from your competitors. All right, our third input is what I call a component audit. Component audits basically involve taking a look at an established user interface or even interfaces of similar products and developing an understanding of what type of atomic elements are going to be needed. Things like buttons, things like sliders, drop-down menus. all of those individual pieces. Component audits help us to identify those things that are going to be needed. They help us see inconsistencies among current button styles, for example, and they help us see where gaps are and identify patterns that we can then build upon and improve as we start to design the new feature or the new app. Next up is one that we've used a fair amount here in the last year at Cantina, and that's a design preference test. And it's just, if you see the sample here, basically it's showing something on the left and something on the right. Usually this is comes out of a component audit. We have shown here 2 search fields in the top left, and we're comparing visual styles here. So this is something that helps to establish database decision making. Preference tests are good for getting feedback from a large group of stakeholders. We generally will put a set of 20 preference tests together, and then on an individual basis have stakeholders go through those and make decisions about which style of different buttons and form fields they feel best convey what they're trying to do. That gives us a set of data that we can look back on and understand some broader patterns about what types of visual styles are needed. And then the last one is a kind of a broad bucket, but one that you've probably heard of several times before, and that's a mood board. There's many different flavors of these, but I'm going to talk about them here just in the context of anything that focuses on gathering inspiration from other sources. It's not creating new stuff, it's going out into the world on places like Dribbble, and even Pinterest has become large for this recently, gathering other examples and imagery, and then using that to start to talk about the look and feel of the site. Mood boards of many different styles are good for exploring diverse directions, and they're quick to create. There's actually a lot of tools that are available now that allow you to snag images from the web and put them into a consistent page or some consistent structure where you can quickly compare things. All right, so as we've seen, each of these inputs to visual design has a specific role. However, they don't represent a checklist for success. Like any good carpenter will tell you, it's important to have a broad toolkit, and that allows you to select the right tool for the job. To correctly find the input suited for the visual design task, we have to actually start with a clear understanding of a project's goals and high-level outcomes, and use that information to make determinations about the appropriate visual design output that we need to be working towards. A design project focused on a brand new mobile app, for instance, will have a very different visual design need than a project focused on extending the functionality of an existing web application. So let's take a look at some of the outputs listed in our framework and how they can ultimately drive the selection of appropriate inputs. First up is comps and page views. So we talked a little bit about comps before. They still have their place, they're just no longer enough on their own. Full page views are still needed to define how atomic components build up to template layouts. But these views should be designed with an atomic focus, and they need to be paired with something else that thinks about that entire system. Comps and full page designs are also important for seeing the overall look and feel of broad device categories like desktop, tablet, mobile, as long as it's understood that these aren't pixel-perfect representations of the final product. In today's device world, we don't have one, iPad, tablet, one screen size for a mobile phone. We have an endless array of devices, and so we have to understand that we're designing an example of what it will look like. We're not designing the final product with a comp. Next up is a pattern library or a style guide. Again, there's many flavors of these, but at their most basic level, they explain the various components and all their various states and modes. So you think of button states that look different when you hover over them, different modes for certain UI components when you're logged in as an administrator versus a regular user role. These are all things that can be captured in the pattern library. Pattern libraries also provide the building blocks for future layouts and future features. They promote a common understanding of UI and visual styles for teams, and we got a good example of this with the Lonely Planet one. The next 3 outputs that we're going to talk about are actually focused on different types of prototypes. Prototypes are representations of the final interface that will help us test and validate certain design hypotheses. They're not the real thing, but they're an approximation of the real thing. In the last couple of years, there's been an explosion of prototyping tools, but the examples I'm going to give here focus again on those that are especially helpful for visual design, not necessarily wireframing or more earlier stage UX work. The first one here is what I call a flows prototype. At its essence, this is something that is exported of static screens from a design program like Photoshop or Sketch, and then those screens are synced together using clickable hotspots in a program like InVision or Marvel. These are good because they're really quick to create, they're easily editable, and they help to uncover flow issues as you click through and go page to page. A more precise type of prototype, and another one on our output list, is an interaction prototype. These are focused more on specific animations and micro interactions. They help to demonstrate final visual polish, say of how a menu slides open on a mobile app. And they tend to be flashy, but they're very focused. In an interaction prototype, you're not going to see a lot of different page views. You're going to be focused in more on how to get from page A to page B or open a menu or something along those lines. A couple of tools that are popular here. Atomic is one that's out. And actually, a few folks here at Cantina have been excited about a new one, Principle, which is specifically for the Mac environment. And then finally, we get to our last output. This is the full HTML prototype. Comps and early prototypes aren't in the final medium, and so there's always an early risk that they're going to miss something. A full HTML prototype is the real thing built and rendered in the browser, which is where the site or app is ultimately going to live. If the design project you're working on is complex or has unproven functionality, I'm thinking of specifically a lot of graphing tools or really complex things like that, this is the type of prototype that's going to best let you understand what's going to work and what's not going to work from a design perspective. All right, as I mentioned earlier, the lists in this framework are by no means comprehensive. There are many more software tools and research techniques that can help drive high-level design and architecture decisions before high-fidelity visual design comes into play. When it's time for full-fledged visual design work, though, this framework of inputs and outputs will help to ensure that design decisions are made with thoughtful consideration of all the appropriate factors. In addition to providing a better understanding of the various inputs and outputs, you might have noticed me highlighting a few other important concepts that support the visual design work we do, stuff that occurred through our discussion of both the inputs and outputs. I want to take a few minutes now to call these out more specifically and talk about how the concept of lean UX influences visual design. So many digital product teams are familiar at this point with Jeff Goeltz's book, Lean UX, and it's focused on quick, iterative cycles of building, testing, and learning. Many of these ideas are relevant for the visual design process, and I wanted to highlight a few of them here. First is the critical need to be clear about exactly what's being designed, which design problems you are attempting to solve right now, and what assumptions you are making about related work tasks that can be investigated further later but allow you to focus on the task at hand right now. Basically, this comes down to we can't solve everything at once. We need to be explicit about what we're focusing on first, solve that, making some assumptions about some of the related ideas, and then circle back to those other ideas once we have a firm understanding of the first problem. Clearly framing this problem up front helps us to define what success really looks like. Only after the design problem is defined can we understand what tools are appropriate. And Lean UX is a big advocate of lightweight tools and a focus on the end result, not simply a series of design deliverables that are reviewed and improved. To that degree, it's about getting to that final experience and building things that move us towards that, not doing wireframes and visual design comps and any number of other deliverables simply to get those to an approval stage and move forward. It's always focused on that end result. So an important part of Lean UX that we embrace as well is the idea of opening the design process up to everyone involved. Design is an inherently collaborative type of work, and the best solutions are those that incorporate multiple perspectives from both product specialists and experts in the business. By working closely with our clients and sharing progress early in the design cycle, we can quickly demonstrate different lines of exploration. Putting stakeholders in a collaborative position instead of simply being an approver of work improves both overall quality and the communication on the product. Finally, Lean UX places an emphasis on getting feedback from real users on a regular basis. Design decisions need to be driven by a group of people that will ultimately use the product, and they're going to make or break the success of that app or website, so it's important to get their info. Contrary to popular thinking, getting user feedback doesn't require a big formal process. It does, however, require a commitment to talk to real people about their frustrations, preferences, and workflow when using a given tool. Each of these principles are important to consider during visual design because they reduce the potential for spending too much time and money pursuing designs that don't help us directly reach our goals. In essence, Lean UX helps us build better digital experiences faster and more effectively. So to help put these principles into practice, here are a few quick tips to incorporate into the visual design process. To ensure you're working as collaboratively as possible, consider setting up a war room or a conference room where all team members can have access to whiteboards and, most importantly, each other as things come up and discussions need to be had. Even if it's only for a portion of the day, being in the same space, builds momentum and improves collaboration. Another tip is to set up regular, often daily, check-ins to discuss work in progress as a full team. This helps all parties see the design work as it evolves, and it avoids too many big deliverable presentations. Everyone's usually more on board if they've been part of the process than if they have to review something at only set points across the project. Lastly, anytime design is being discussed, be sure to start the conversation by repeating context and framing the problem you're trying to solve. If this particular iteration that you're working on grew out of a specific feedback discussion or a specific request, repeat that for everyone on the team so that they know where this comes from and everyone's on the same page during this particular review. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground at this point. And in addition to the previous process tips, I thought it would be good to look at an example from the real world of something that we've done at Cantina using this Design IO framework and the principles of atomic design and Lean UX. I've removed any identifying information so we can get the most, so this webinar can benefit the broadest audience. But what I'm showing here is a general process timeline of something we did recently for an enterprise client. For this project, we were asked to design and build the initial version of a multi-level assessment app. For this particular project, the client came to us with a flows prototype, as I described it earlier, which was basically a clickable set of static pages in InVision, actually. They had fleshed out the overall structure of what this thing needed to look like. They had a broad level page where you could drill down to individual levels or steps. And then from those steps, you could actually dig into the actual exercises themselves. So knowing that we had a good wireframe essentially to start with, we then did a couple of things. In parallel to the metaphor questions that we sent to the group, we did a brand analysis and a component audit, looking at the flows prototype and looking at a couple of not competitor apps, but other similarly focused types of tools. Once we had all the information from those metaphor questions, which gave us an understanding of the style and the overall sort of visual look that they were hoping to achieve, we combined that with some of the select concepts from their current brand. In this case, that didn't turn out to be a lot, but we did pull in some colors and made some choices about some particular layout decisions that reference some things that their users were familiar with. And then we took the last, or let's say the top 3 components. We focused specifically on buttons, some type styles, and then there was a lot of form fields involved in this particular app. So we took those 3 components and put together a design preference test using those things. The example I showed earlier actually was a screenshot from that test. We had 15 to 20 examples of button styles, form fields, drag and drop interactions, a lot of things of that nature, which we had the stakeholders go through and basically pick A or B, what their preference was. Once we had that data, we combined that with our previous analysis, and we're able to make some clear decisions about what they were looking for from a visual design perspective. At that point, we took those top components and we created a really simplified style guide This is probably 30 steps below what we showed with the Lonely Planet one, but it was really focused on a couple of key components and how that was going to look for hover states, form fields, what they look like when you interacted with them, and basically we put together this really rough style guide where we defined each of those atomic components. Once we had this done, and while development was actually working on building that style guide in the browser, we were able to then focus in on the page views and start designing things at more of that page view level, so that once those things were created and ready to be built, the components were all ready to be tucked right into those designs. We didn't have to worry about designing, or the development team didn't have to worry about designing buttons when they were just looking to place buttons and organize the page. So it turned out to be a really successful series of exercises. This project ultimately is something that we're still working on to this day, and it's been a good example of this process and the framework that we've talked about today. All right, so we appreciate your patience, and we're going to talk about just a couple of key takeaways from some of this stuff that you can hopefully take back and either incorporate into your own work or think about as you're selecting a design vendor or bringing in a team to help you on a particular design challenge. So as you can see, digital interfaces of today require a keen understanding of both technology and how people will be interacting with the product. By working with your team to clearly define the desired visual design outputs, one can ensure the right information is input at the start of that process. The iterative process of building, testing, and learning is better when all parties are working together collaboratively and constantly gathering real user feedback. It's through those conversations that key decisions are made. And then we have incorporating atomic design principles and lean UX principles. Incorporating these two principles helps make sure that we're focusing on the system as a whole, not only key pages and views. Using many of these exercises that we've described today and incorporating principles of both atomic design and lean UX has allowed us at Cantina to continue to create effective design solutions for our clients. And this process is something that we're continuing to refine and learn more of every day. And I think that's one of the big takeaways. So thanks for your time. I think we're going to toss it back to Clark, and we're ready for any questions.
Great, Sam. That was wonderful. And I bet a lot of the attendees had some great takeaways that they can bring back to their team. So like Sam said, we will now open the floor to questions. A couple have already come in from a few attendees. But if you do have a question, please post it in the chat window, and we'll make sure to answer it. So Sam, one of the questions that have come in from one of the attendees, the person asked, can the right design inputs and outputs for a given project change over time?
That's a great question, yeah. To answer that, yeah, absolutely. You actually might have picked up through this that we talked earlier about Lonely Planet and their pattern library. They're a good example because in a case like that, once that pattern library or style guide is already established, that actually becomes a design input for any future functionality or new pages that Lonely Planet's going to be adding to their website or any of their app platforms. So while on one hand, for the initial design project, a pattern library was probably the output of that specific design effort. Once that's already established, that's a great input for future efforts as well. So inputs and outputs can definitely change over time. And again, it comes down to what is that specific goal of this moment in time of what is that highest priority design task.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Someone else asked, kind of on a related note of Lonely Planet, besides Lonely Planet, what other good examples of pattern libraries or style guides have you seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot out there, and that's one of the things personally that I really enjoy about our industry is that a lot of this stuff is publicly available so that people can learn and try and test new and different things. A couple of good ones that I've seen recently, there's obviously a lot of flavors, but from a pure visual design style standpoint, IBM, believe it or not, has a great what they call design language framework, which breaks out how they think about color, how they think about type, how they think about animation. It's less focused on specific UI, but has some great principles that designers can use as an input to the design process when they're creating new animations or new pages for that site. Another good one, which is pretty commonly referenced, is MailChimp. They seem to do great work over there, and they have more of a true pattern library that you can find online. That's a really good one. And then the only other piece that I am thinking of is that there's actually a site, it's called styleguides.io, which some folks have put together that aggregates a lot of these type of pattern libraries and style guides, and that's a great resource as well. So definitely check that out, styleguides.io.
Great, I'm sure people will. Well, thank you, Sam, so much for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who was on the call participating this morning. A few announcements before we wrap up. We'll be posting the slides and the audio recording of this webinar on our website, cantina.co, and we'll send you an email to let you know when that is available to access. We will do another webinar happening in January, so you'll keep a lookout on that, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you for joining.